How to Get Third-Party Risk Management Right, a case study featuring Pfizer's Keith Lichtenwalner. Keith is the Senior Manager of Security Risk Management and Governance. You're also joined by Prevalent's Chief Third-Party Evangelist and Senior Director of Networks, Brenda Ferraro. My name is Peter Schumacher, your webinar host for today. I've got just a couple of housekeeping items to cover before we can get started. First of all, a reminder that all attendee lines are muted. But in an effort to keep this session interactive, we invite you to submit your questions using the Zoom console. Time permitting, at the end of the hour, we'll host a live Q&A. Today's webinar is being recorded, and in the next business day or so, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to that recording. So I know you didn't join to hear my voice, so at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Keith and Brenda. Thanks so much for joining us today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Keith, welcome. I'm really excited to let everybody know all the great work that you've been doing over the past year on maturing your third-party risk program. Are you ready to get started?
I certainly am.
So we will need to change slides, and here's the presenters for today, just so that you can see what we look like. I tried to get a non-fuzzy picture of Keith, but to no avail. We're gonna keep it as it is. But as you heard, I'm the Chief Third-Party Evangelist and Senior Director of Networks for Prevalent. I've been at Prevalent for 2 years, but my history of third-party risk has spanned across 6 years, and I have an IT background of 20+ years. How about you, Keith? When did you get into third-party?
I spent 27 years in the chemical sector and spent about 15 of that actually doing third-party risk management and other risk management, and have since moved the last 3 years to Pfizer, where I've been more focused on risk management and plant cybersecurity. So this has been a passion area for me for at least about 17, 18 years now.
And the two of us have worked together maybe over 4 years with the HISAC, is that correct?
Yeah, it's 3+, yeah. Sliding it on 4.
Wow. All right, well, let's get started. I'm sure everybody doesn't want to know the history of how we've met, but we'll talk about why we're here today. So third-party risk has evolved from a position of collecting content to become aware, maybe using attestations, on better understanding where your entities, third parties, vendors, or suppliers are with securing their controls. And if those actually match what your customer requirements are for compliance and regulatory needs. What Prevalent has done is we have the ability to assess, monitor, and share with a 360 approach. We are able to collect once and share with many when it comes to questionnaires. We're able to share with you an outside and an inside look of your vendors and entities and what they have in place for their third-party risk. And the networks that we have available within the industries is helping us to tell the communities exactly what the vulnerabilities are as we move forward and understand better what the threat landscape is changing to. So we're going to dip into a poll question at the beginning of this session to ask all of you how many questions are in your primary assessment questionnaire. So Peter, if you'll start that poll, we'll watch and see what we get from the audience. So really, we want to talk more about what's just in the questionnaire, because questionnaires only tell you what your entities inform you about their controls, right, Keith? So we look at that and we say, oh my goodness, we've got all these controls and here's what they're telling us. And we have to trust what they're telling us is the truth, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of the monitoring piece. It helps you get the full vision into, are you getting a quality questionnaire response? To the indicators from the monitoring piece support the questionnaires responses as everything looks to be in sync. So indicating good quality direction is to me, they complement each other very well.
All right, so it looks like we've got about 60% of the people voted. So we'll go ahead and end that poll and share it out. Peter, would you like to do that? And there's about 50% of us on the call out of the majority that voted that said that they have between 100 and 500 questions in their primary assessment questionnaire. All right. Well, that's interesting to know. And sometimes on the vendor side of the house, it ends up being a situation where that's a lot of questionnaires and sometimes they're not meaningful or relevant. So we want to start focusing on relevant, meaningful content in efforts to identify risk and mitigate what's important to those engagements. Keith, let's talk about the unified risk-based approach that you put into place recently.
Yeah, so the main points of this slide that I really want to stress home are really what that lead-in question was talking about. Our primary questionnaire that we've used the last year and a half or 2 years is really revolving around sector reuse, and it's 228 questions. But what we've learned over that time by really looking at, we collect the right metadata up front about the vendor and some basic things that if they're available, like the SOC 2s, et cetera. We're able to really focus that down on about 15% of those questions are really the ones that change our mind, whether we would or would not enter into contract. Or will we continue a contract on an existing party. So we call these the key controls. We call these the controls when we look at assessing our risk. If we were building the service ourselves, these are the controls that we would absolutely want to develop into the requirements list. So we started with that control list and then went back to the questionnaire that we had and used the concept of basically saying, what questions in here are leading indicators to me that this vendor is actually meeting that control in an appropriate fashion. So we'll take a good hard look at that, pick 1 or 2 questions that really make sure that that control is likely present. And that gives us a really good indication with a very ability to really look at things quickly, focus in on the highest risks, and really drive the investment of our assessors, our business, and et cetera, on the most important controls that the lack thereof would hurt them the most. And that means I can really share and disposition and track to closure. I can manage the most critical risks to Pfizer and thus drive those to closure rather than trying to be a purist solve it all. I can solve the most important items. So that's what I would take away from this slide.
So I remember when we started working together on Prevalent and Pfizer maturing the program, can you remind me if it's true that you were using Excel spreadsheets at the beginning?
Yeah, certainly the process started out with Excel spreadsheets, which doesn't lend itself to a true risk-based driven approach with automated workflows and things like that. It's cumbersome. Trying to enforce good quality data and answering is difficult in an Excel spreadsheet. And it just, a lot of passing back and forth, time delays because of sitting in email, getting lost in email, just all those things really didn't enable us to really hold the vendor accountable for the collection phase, hold the assessor accountable with an SLA to perform the assessment, and also in the share and distribution and track, really hold based on the risk, either our Pfizer business owner accountable, and for the most critical risks, we're still holding them accountable, but we're also giving that governance oversight in order to make our board of directors and our site so satisfied and confident that I have driven this risk in the direction that they are requesting.
I'm really happy that you've elevated your maturity from a spreadsheet into a workflow and automated capability so that you can now start to make decisions based on more intel at your fingertips. So that's awesome. So their next polling question is, have you automated your third-party assessment program to collect risk information beyond using Excel workbooks? So Peter, if you don't mind starting that polling question, we'll give them a chance to respond. I would love to get closer to 100% vote. So for those of you at home, at work, in the car, don't do it in the car, please don't crash, but we'd like to find out where we are with everyone on this. it's very interesting, Keith. I talk to a lot of industry companies, and there are many companies that are still using Excel.
Yeah, and certainly if you're a small entity, that's possibly the best place to lie if you really don't. But as soon as you want to get into volume and you want to really drive a risk-based look and approach, there's just capabilities that became important to us that you'll hear about as we continue talking, that I really think you need a tool to step that game up. And the beauty of it is we have found a clear efficiency to increase our number of assessments capable per FTE by a very considerable amount. And in the end, that's a return on investment. And that's really where we've, really measured ourselves against to make sure that we are making the right investments and looking at the right vendors. So we not only measure the tools efficiency on personnel to return on volume or capacity, but we also measure, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the banding and measurements we do on how percentages of our fleet that we've measured, how many are actually have no problems to how many we're really turning up significant core must-have controls, key control failures that we're driving change with that vendor.
Yeah, well, it looks like we got 61% of the vote, so if we want to end that and share it out, that would be great. And pleasing to the eye, there are 45% of those that voted that said no, they are not using Excel spreadsheets or workbooks anymore. 27% said yes, they are. 18% said they're in the process, and 10% said not applicable to me. Thank you for those results. So let's start talking about how the risk-based approach phase comes to play. So we wanted to help you at Pfizer to build a process using very simplistic 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. The first one is prepare. The second one is collect. The third one is assess and evaluate. And the fourth is track and remediate. We also wanted to give you the ability to have flexible automated workflow. So would you like to talk about what Prevalent did with their program in efforts to use this 4-step approach and phase for risk-based assessments?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. This really fit well with my internal vision of how I look at really meeting the business's needs for timely, efficient enablement of them knowing the risk that they're either about to take on, entering in a new contract, or the risk they're currently operating with an existing vendor. So in the prepare, the part I'll highlight there is this is really having the right metadata about the vendor engagement when you fire it off. So really having custom field capabilities where you can capture those couple of extra fields that just really enable automation and response in those difficult cases, those oddball situations, where you got some of that metadata right at your fingertips, enabling the resources to really execute efficiently. The collect phase, very important here to really have automated emails, automated tasks, to really do the handoffs from ourselves to Prevalent to do for the collection activities, to the vendor being driven and reminded, and then right back to us so that we can actually coordinate the return of the validated questionnaire, turn around that and have that turn into an assessor's action delivered without, in box 3 there, without a whole lot of extra work, really have the questionnaire post and automatically generate the email that has, here's the key control deficiencies sorted to the top, ready for the assessor to validate. Few seconds, doesn't look out of place, that assessor is going to take it right to the business, and then based on risk, either deliver to the business and the business tracks themselves, or if the risk is high enough, obviously, then we're oversight governance tracking that and driving for remediation and consulting with the business through those steps. So having a workflow, SLAs from start to finish, and accountability clear with escalation paths is critical to our success in really getting that efficiencies per FTE that we want to have.
Yeah, and I think what's great is the fact that we went through the process of defining the vendor universe that you had, or the supplier universe as you call it, and then having the ability to have the scale and efforts to quickly identify risk by asking questions with the questionnaires and even using some of your other solutions to embed the cross-reference of if that information was appropriate or not. And then when we worked on the whiteboard, we call it whiteboard magic. Keith and I love markers and whiteboards. We were able to identify the doubling of FTE productivity by moving away from a Excel spreadsheet to a program that now has the capability of giving you the information right at your fingertips with a workflow that's automated, the chasers are automated, and so on and so forth. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think the workflow is just the ability to create tasks and the ability to just drive clean handoffs in a common tool that isn't getting buried in the emails and everything else, and giving you email reminders of your tasks are coming due and things. It's all part of just enabling each of those key components, those key people, at being able to balance a very busy workload, because that's just the world we all operate in.
I agree. So let's dig into the phased approach. I believe that you were going to speak to this slide about all the components on what you need in order to prepare for success.
Yeah, what I really want to walk people through here is to really think about when you're preparing. It's like anything else. The better you prepare, the easier the I'm going to say the request will go, and your service will succeed. In this slide, I'll bring highlight to a couple parts here. The first one is the supplier profile. Really take the time to plan out what is that critical information that you need to make all the rest of the steps go successfully. Collecting that metadata about the supplier and just a 2-sentence description of what are we trying to do with this supplier, and making the business write that down really helps the assessors understand what's important and what's not. Really knowing those kind of things. The control standards, knowing your own standards internally that you expect somebody to meet, and then really taking your questionnaire rules, as I call it, is really looking at your questionnaire you're using and say, well, which questions really are leading indicators that the controls I expect are present. We certainly help in the supplier profile by collecting facts like how much, SPI data is exposed to this vendor, or is this vendor operationally critical to the cash flow and activities of Pfizer, et cetera. Those things collected in the supplier profile allow us to really classification model of the data exposed and the importance of the vendor to us. We certainly leverage contract addendums and standardization. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And most importantly, the workflow status, really taking the time to think a little bit about, do you have enough workflow status states to really know where and who is holding up stuff running through your engine here that you're trying to get satisfied as far as requests? And do you have enough states that really support your metrics and KPIs, so you know where you can do improvements in your process, where you're really falling short, and then also why are we falling short there can be focused on and continue to drive to the efficiencies and the turnaround that enables your business to hit their deadlines. Because in a lot of these cases, contract renewals, contract negotiations, every day is the business losing the ability to reach those benefits thereafter.
And I really like the part about the stakeholder commitment, because if you have a steering committee that's available for disposition items, making sure that if you're going to accept a third party or a supplier to move forward, knowing that they have risk, that stakeholder commitment and having a steering committee is really key.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the supplier profiles. What's the one thing that you learned, or maybe the two things that you learned from going through your program redesign that helped you to better know who your suppliers were and what things were important to know about each one for workflow consistency?
Yeah, probably the number one challenge that I've just continued to learn over all the years is having accurate and motivated contacts, both inside of your company as the business owner, as well as with the vendor, is probably the biggest number one challenge in data quality coming into, especially if you're launching. We like to do retrofit of existing vendor reviews, and we like to do them in what we call waves or bundles. And when you're doing a couple hundred of those at a shot, you pretty much have to expect that you got a 10% data quality issue, in that we're seeing, at least one contact per entity or multiple, whether that be internal contact or external, will actually change per year in your fleet. So if you launch 100, that means you got 10 that are going to stumble. And making sure that from the last slide where I talked about having your workflow status is right, being able to flag up when an email bounces non-deliverable, being able to know when something didn't get through in the first expected SLA point by the vendor. Did the vendor register? Have they even answered if they answered 15 questions, at least we know how we have the right person, they registered and started answering questions. Having that visibility is critical to knowing quickly and early when you probably have a bad contact. So managing contacts, watching for those contacts being in error and how that'll manifest itself in KPI problems and et cetera, is critical to success. And that's probably really the part that I would take away from this slide.
I think about the custom fields that you're creating that help you to understand if there are pertinent content information to know for reporting purposes, such as what is the information that is about, are they onshore, are they offshore, who's the assessor, things that are very easy for you to put your fingertip on. And then can you talk a little tiny bit about where did you start? You have so many third parties and suppliers. How did you know where to begin?
Yeah, to selecting where to begin, I think as a risk manager, my attitude is very much pick a way to identify where you think your largest risks are, and start with the first part of your program. I think the biggest mistake is that somebody thinks they got to do the whole ocean in the first set of waves. And getting started, perfecting your process, perfecting the data that you need to support your process. I'm certainly convinced that in 1 year we were able to do a lot more by having that attitude than if we tried to perfect it, because I don't think we would have gotten most of the way through the year and would have struggled with the step change and probably not got a whole lot done in the last quarter, versus getting some done and just scaling it up as we go. So making concerted step changes and planning for those, I think, is important. Certainly selecting the first one, look at your criteria and put your business hat on. Sit with the business, understand what could be some of the best triggers. I think you'll find a lot of your procurement departments that I've worked with throughout my career, they have the concept of strategic partners or the most important vendor list, because it's just pivotal to the company. They know it is. Finding that list and talking to them about why. Also sitting with the business and asking the question is, what is if you provide multiple services, which are the ones that really provide the most revenue? And then asking the question, well, what vendors are critical to the production of that revenue? And really understanding that as critical, looking at your compliance laws. And then another area we found a lot of value in is we look at we call it basically a partner connection, where we are connecting our network with other key partners, and through firewalls, obviously. But really, that's something that as part of the IT digital services departments, we have the data on that. So it's something you can mine and data that we can easily get at and really find the ones where we're exposing the most risk, because we're opening ports and things between key partners, there's certainly different levels of that. And understanding that, using your firewall data to help drive you from the data, we found extremely successful at finding what are really the top partners with those criteria that could help us focus our time, money, and energy.
Another thing that I believe you did, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you went forward with a regulatory methodical approach. So you picked a bucket or a tranche of your particular supply profile, and you started with them based on the needs of compliance and regulation.
Correct. Certainly with the key questions that we want to have, the key controls, certainly privacy, we identified 26 key questions that really are leading indicators of those controls being in a responsible status. And that really helps us to focus that in. Obviously, when you go beyond that strict regulatory, there's operational controls that are critical to the service providing and maturity and availability of a service. And that's where we clearly added another 9 to 10 that really puts us into really our 35 indicating questions that drive our key control list.
Excellent. So let's go into our next polling question. Do you hold yourself and your third parties to the same security control standard requirements? Peter, do you want to pop that up? This one's kind of a favorite for me because I always look at the fact that we need to make sure that we are identifying that our controls that we are using within our castle and four walls are actually being held true and in force at the third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, and nth parties. So this is a critical one that I feel is very important. How about you, Keith?
Absolutely, and it goes the opposite direction as well. Don't hold them to a standard that you're not prepared to meet either. And I've seen some compliance-oriented programs where it's like, I want to pass on every one of the questions that I ask. And realistically, there's good business reasons why not everybody does everything the same way. And that can cause so really focusing on the key controls, the key risks, understanding when the others are potentially, when you're failing a key risk, to say, well, what are the related questions that I want to understand, which may help me put a full picture around it. That's where the assessor gets value from potentially a few extra questions that are answered. And there are, based on risk, absolutely places where you want to ask a lot more questions and have that knowledge.
All right, so let's go ahead and end the poll. And it looks like we have 69% say yes, they do, and then 18% say no, and then 14% say not sure. It looks like that question has a little bit of a typo in it, but it was basically asking you if you were expecting the same control standards of your third parties as you do yourself.
Sorry, Brenda, that was my fault.
That's okay, Peter. I have mistakes too. It makes us human, so I'm glad you're not a robot. Thank you for that. All right, so we'll stop sharing that result and we will move on to the next slide. And as we're moving to the next slide, the one thing that I want to bring to all of your attention is, during my discussions with companies, and Pfizer included, is that we take an approach with our vendors not to hand slap them because they don't have the control in place, but to really make it so that we're evolving the ecosystem and the community to help those other companies that may not be large. They're more small to medium size, and they need assistance in becoming more mature with those security items and control standards. So let's talk about control standards and what you learned about what happens when you create key controls and what that really means to you in efforts to evolve.
Sure. So first of all, key controls defined by me is really what are the controls that we would say are absolutely, we like the words must-haves when we're designing, if we were implementing the actual solution ourselves. And then we went back to the questionnaire and said, which questions, if answered correctly, a majority of the use cases or experience we had is a room full of control experts, both compliance individuals, risk-based individuals, security professionals, and et cetera. What is our experience? And what we really looked at is we found that 15% of the questions we had really gave us that visibility. And then we did about 100 vendors where we did both a full look at all the questions as well as just focused on the core controls. And when we did that, we really found that we could get from those, 15% of the questions, we could get at least 80% of the security clarity that we really wanted, and we could do it much faster, and really focus in on the biggest risks. And as a unit, there's a place and time to look at everything. Certainly when you have a compliance thing and it's the absolute most important, top vendor of your company for your company's success, you're going to look at more of the questions. But in a lot of the cases, what we found is we could quickly determine this vendor, is just really in good standing. And what we found is when we were seeing a lot of that, we really didn't have a big deal, and we couldn't find anything even when we looked harder at the rest of the questions of any significance. But then when we did find these key controls failing, especially when they had a significant number of them failing, it really was a company with a poor cybersecurity program. And then we really knew this was a place we wanted to focus in based on the risk of that entity to our business to really help the business put their energy where they would get the most return on reducing their risks to their operations and their compliance requirements. So surely on this slide, I'm really stressing focus on the key controls, driven by your engagement, which you should be collecting. What is the engagement I'm doing as part of the metadata when the vendor is being initiated? And the controls may be different from a privacy engagement where your privacy data exchange is really the goal versus somebody that's providing more of an operational critical service to the business. You may have more controls in the latter that makes sense. But if you look at a lot of the privacy-based controls, they're just good, pure best practices. And we really push those all the time. And like I said, that first 100 we did, we really proved ourselves that, more than 95% of the time, we could look a lot harder, but it was really on those few that we already had the indication that there was a serious problem or there was no problem at all by the core, just looking at the core must-have critical key control questions.
Yeah, I think that what I really appreciate from the thought leadership that you've put forth in your program is that you defined the key controls by engagement, and sometimes the number was not the same. You would make sure that it was relevant for your departments to know what items needed to be risk mitigated versus the same risk mitigation and prioritization of those risks across every single vendor or supplier you had. And the other thing that you did was you created a risk library. So if a risk was not met, you had what was expected already programmed into the solution so that your assessors could speak the same language with the third party or supplier or vendor to let them know you haven't met this, there's a compensating control, maybe we will agree to take on. However, this is the timeline, this is what we're looking for. So you're really improving the ecosystem by providing that help based on the maturity that you have with your own controls.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Certainly taking for those, I'm going to say, key control questions that we are flagging up and really writing out a repeatable response and taking the time to write that in business language. Not only are we finding a much more responsive vendor situation, but more importantly, we've really been able to write it in a way that our Pfizer business owners really find a value of once they start understanding that they can understand why we're pushing it. They then can really run with the report that comes out of the system and act accordingly. And in a lot of cases, we're finding more and more percentage-wise where the internal Pfizer business owner, I got this. I'm going to the vendor. I'm not happy with these issues. I'll deal with them. And they're really driving off and saying, this one's a little different on a small percentage, and really wanting the assessor's assistance. The first time a given Pfizer business owner, they still want some hand-holding and guidance, but the more we can self-enable them, the more volume we can handle, the more we can be there to look at that next part of our ecosystem and fleet of vendors to make sure that we're looking at more versus focusing our energy on the few. So the more wide look I get, the more I feel like I'm assured that I have balanced the total risks of Pfizer.
That makes a lot of sense. Questionnaires, rules, and risk evaluation. This is a topic that seems to be cropping up across all industries. And it's something that maybe you can help the people on the call learn about. What exactly did you find when you went through making these rules and defining those risk evaluation criteria items?
Yeah, when you define it, I think we kind of said how I did it. I think the message I wanted to just bring out in this slide is when you're budgeting for your response at the end, you can really lower your costs based on the last comment I just made of, writing your standard responses up in advance. But in the center there, I did find about a third of my vendors really had no core risk key control issues. So I just left those roll past and moved on. But that means that there is another larger percentage where I'm really saying we need to work on, and budgeting resources and making a plan to write up those canned responses really help manage the time and energy being put at the right place. So budget for that resources. Several other peers I've talked to, it seems like that 1/3 being in good standing, no real action needed to be taken, is kind of the norm that I've seen in a couple of people that I've talked with. It just seems to be kind of statistically where things are falling.
And what's great about the solution is that each individual customer has the ability to place in their own risk tolerance and risk ranking. So for example, with the healthcare space in the network, you will have a repository of completed questionnaires and content and evidence that's been collected from the third party or the supplier. And then when it gets ported into the Pfizer instance or view, you have configured the solution to be appropriate to your risk tolerance, appetite, and attitude, so that you could really determine what those risk-based decisions are in the event that you have someone that's maybe a cloud provider versus someone who may be someone who's doing manufacturing for you. And that's what I kind of enjoy watching evolve with your program, with the way that you're able to slice and dice and risk rank based on those tolerance levels.
Absolutely.
Classification models is a big thing with a lot of the companies. Once they start looking at their portfolio and they notice they have tens to hundreds to thousands to multi-thousands of vendors and suppliers, knowing what type of assessment that is applicable to each type of classification is something that some of the companies are struggling with. How did you define what was going to get what type of due diligence?
Yeah, I think it's important to think up front in the prepare phase, and that's really what I want to stress with this slide is, in our case, in our sector, really in the prepare phase, understanding for each vendor engagement, giving a vendor's risk level as well as potentially an engagement level risk level, those things can be drastically different. And the example I'll use is especially vendors that provide many different services. A good example is IBM, because they provide everything from PC solutions to consulting services to Watson to et cetera. And they're just one of a great many examples where their services are just the gamut, and the risk can be totally different. So be careful to understand what you're doing, leverage the data. And I think on the screen you see some of the things that we make sure that we collect some knowledge about. We try to keep the questionnaire to determine the risk level down to about 15 check the box type questions. so that the business can really pick those by banding. Like, I'm not going to tell me the exposed level of SPI data you expose or number of research compound datas are exposed. I'll ask them to say, do you expose which band of any of this? And if they say yes, select the band. And the bands are pretty broad, but the bands give me an understanding of that critical high, medium, low vendor engagement that I want to be focused on. So I think keeping it simple for the business, keeping it in their language, but look at your own company classification model and some of these factors as you design it out.
Yeah, and the last item we have in the prepare phase is about contracts. And the one thing that I noticed here was a lot of companies go through the stress of redlining. And then in some cases, those contracts may say they only have right to audit once per year. But let it be known that an audit is different than an assessment. So yes, you can have someone come and audit you once per year, but an assessment is ongoing. It's a continuing evaluation. It's based off of if incidents occur or if a remediation is not remediated in time or if there's a risk that needs to be checked on. But what are the things that you noticed from a contracting perspective when you evolved your program?
Yeah, it's difficult to keep with the amount of contracts going and et cetera, and that really helping to influence your procurement and your legal department to really make addendums based on the controls required, so that there's an addendum if this is a privacy related contract versus not, an addendum for cybersecurity operations, et cetera, and keeping them in addendums so that what you can do is say, let's put the right addendums on the contract and not having legal time on both our side, their side, redlining documents that really are not applicable. Obviously, if the service is going to change, you want to make sure that you add those in. And that's certainly part of the risk that you need to manage. But sometimes you spend a lot more money trying to get pieces and parts when you put everything mixed together. So keeping it simple and straightforward, trying to get that work together and partnering with procurement and legal is probably critical to the success of really making sure you're assessing the cybersecurity balance points. And at Pfizer, it's obviously the privacy office is one of our key partners as well.
Well, we're now at the phase 2 collection, so we're getting close. We only have about 15 minutes, so we'll try to make sure we hit the next couple of slides in detail. But what are some of the lessons learned that you had to plan for, or you want to let others know to make sure that they plan for with regards to collection?
Yeah, and I made this list on the right, and I think I've hit a lot of these as we've been walking through. Make sure that you collect the right supplier data and apply it. Make sure that you're prepared to handle for the bumps in the road. The M&A impact is one that has always frustrated us in that there's always that question of, we were finding about 10% of our vendors through a year are basically could be literally part of an M&A situation. And then you got to really ask the question, which company, the one you were working with or the one that acquired them, is actually driving the control set? Because that's who you really want to assess. So making sure you understand and have a process for that, that's definitely a lesson that don't underestimate. Getting the right milestones tracked. Again, keep capturing that right data. Think about the data you need throughout your life cycle and get it up front. Collect it before you launch it, because that really is the time that you have the business focused on wanting to get the questionnaire launched and moving. And one of the other ones is, this is data that you need to plan for. Make sure you have a primary key to use the data later and share it back. Vendor names is a dangerous area to be your primary key. Looking at what else works for you in addition to that, or as a concatenated key, is critical, because the vendor names change and then you're changing primary key. That all gets very difficult and can get confusing to link things together, especially as you're trying to match your data with procurement data or privacy office data, where they're not even aware of the vendor name change, but you are. So developing internal keys, developing an internal primary key, and getting your key partners using the same key is another area that we are definitely investing focused time to continue to resolve and mature at.
Yeah, and I've been noticing that a lot of companies will say, I've requested for assessments to be completed, and it goes into a black hole, and I don't know when I'm going to get the content back. And so where is my request is really important. And with the Prevalent platform, we've been seeing an uptick and a improvement that it used to take about 45 days to turn around a request and get the content available for risk identification. And that's our key item that we're trying to focus on. Now it's coming back in an average of 9 days, which is phenomenal. And it's reusable and it can be shared. So I'm glad that you're participating in helping us with that. Oh, here's the banding. You've been talking about banding all throughout this webinar. So let's talk to them about exactly what that means for assess and evaluate.
Yeah, in the assessment phase, given the volume we've done and everything else, I think it's really interesting that statistically, we're definitely finding that if you look at a risk-based banding approach, we're finding about a third of the responses are not filling any of our key controls. And we've really taken the attitude of let's focus our energy where you see that bottom one. We still have about 25% of the 100 we've done where we're finding the key controls with that particular vendor is actually failing 7 or more of the risk posture questions, the key must-have key control indicating questions. That's definitely a vendor with a control package problem. And we want to focus in there and really drive with the business to say, when you have a vendor that's been assessed at a critical level as a vendor by the questions of what they've indicated to us as the metadata about that vendor, and they're also failing 7 or more questions of those key controls, that's a high risk, really truly high risk situation that we want to make sure that's where we're putting our energy. So again, it's a little bit giving up on some of those low ones. We'll just tell the business, hey, I did find something here. Please have your discussion with the vendor appropriately, and with the documented risk responses, they're enabled to do that more efficiently and effectively. But this is definitely that balance is there on the left. Do I want to do perfection on each and every one of these, and I'm only going to get through so many in a year, or do I want a good evaluation and I want to get on most of the vendors in my fleet? I'm erring towards that second part. How can I drive myself to get a more encompassing look at my fleet, know where my worst of my worst is, focus on driving that risk down, and then at that point, we may turn focus and change the criteria a bit and find some more, but the answer is I still think I'm driving out the biggest part of the risk on the investment level that I'm making, and that's really what I'm being asked to drive, a return on that investment and a return on reducing the risk we operate with every day.
Right, and with regulatory requirements now mandating that we ID the risk, we make mitigation plans for those that we are accepting and or have compensating controls, and then we track those to closure with disposition. So I really like the way that you've put that together. We usually use this slide at our presentations within Prevalent to show the holistic approach to everything that's required within third-party risk for a mature governance program. So can you point a little bit or a couple seconds on each of the 4 components on how Pfizer has addressed that?
Sure. My philosophy on some of this aligns and some uniqueness to it. First of all, on scores, I think score is a good way of looking at things. It's helpful on low-risk situations, but it really doesn't bring in that holistic look. So I'm more apt to focus on the controls rather than just a pure score look. However, on low risk, it's a quick way of doing it, but everybody's scoring model is different, and if the particular vendor doing the score has not done a good job of thinking about large scale, medium scale, and all, it really can get a little touchy. But it's a good indicator and should be considered. Networks. I think it's critical, like we're doing here today. Learn from our peers. Learn from what people are doing around you. Participated in events like this. Hopefully everybody's going to take away a couple of ideas to look back at their program from what we've said and what I've shared. And I'm sure as I continue to travel around and talk with others, I've always said I've never have a meeting where I don't walk away even reflecting on myself where I could do something better, or hearing a comment from the person or company that I'm talking with and gaining from that a reflection of a place I didn't think through. And the last one that I really wanted to, talk about was kind of the events for a second. We've had an aha moment here that I really have found value in is, well, obviously with brief notification and the amount of vendors we have, we get those periodically. And we have really enabled ourselves with these tools in vendor risk management to really hook ourselves into when we get notified of a breach and we want to take action on what do we do? Do we cut our ties with it, which is pretty much standard operating procedures to cut, a partner connection until we're sure that it's safe to be operating together. When we do those kind of things, really using your tools and your assessments as being part of that process to reinstate business as usual, making sure that that's part of your activities. And we've gotten ourselves hooked in there now, and we're seeing a lot of really good benefits to incident response being tied with a vendor third-party risk management toolbox as far as standard response procedure. We even had a case where we were pretty much able to share and predict how we believe they were breached, and it was amazing how accurate we were, and to the CISO that I was speaking with. So it's a really good thing to have your type of toolbox and look at in your business use cases for it that you might not directly think are appropriate. It's not just contract signing, it can be events that can trigger times that you should use this toolbox and platforms that you develop to really make sure that the vendors that your business is using is safe and secure.
And I think with everything that's on here, it's very cumbersome. There's so much that has to be tracked and mitigated and reviewed, and feed-ins that participate in our governance program. And then I think that what I'd like for everyone to be able to take away is, can you talk about what key takeaways you have experienced in your journey that are important to tell the community?
Sure. So we built this slide internally and in conversations that these are the things that we think are making us successful and we're really using to drive ourselves, that we've learned through the journey of the years. Certainly a risk-based program we believe is the way to make sure our investments are returning. Making sure we're using all the data that we can find and using it creatively. Like I said, using firewall rules to really set the risk level. Making sure that the questions are leading indicators of problem, rather than trying to say I'm going to review every question. Mapping your expected key controls, your risky controls, to the key indicating questions. Prepared for the challenges and escalations. The more you can prepare in advance, and again, I'll go back again, thinking about what data do I need up front, collecting that up front so that I can respond and escalate appropriately, is very important. And as simple as just knowing which business unit is, quote unquote, the primary consumer of this vendor service, makes it easy to say, okay, this is the vice president I'm escalating to. Workflow automation has really improved our ability to assess more with the same FTEs. We're looking at a doubling of our capacity per FTE, and that's really important to us in order to scale to the volumes that we want to do. Planning for your disposition tracking, making sure you know really which critical vendors you want to track and governance over, and where you're going to trust the business is going to take the right action, but making sure that you're educating them in a business terminology that they can act responsibility with what you've identified. And then obviously making sure your data throughout your process, your SLAs and everything really drive to a set of metrics and KPIs that support your escalation, driving your maturity. Find out where things are hanging up in your process, know what they are, and then act accordingly to drive those out of happening again and again.
I really thank you for all of your input today, Keith. I'm going to hand it back over to Peter so that we can hear if there are any questions, and he has a final poll. But again, thank you so much, Keith, in advance.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm just launching this final poll. So basically, we're asking you if you'd like a follow-up from Prevalent, please answer honestly. If you'd like to schedule a follow-up phone call with one of our sales representatives, please say yes. If the answer is no, my feelings will not be hurt. So please answer honestly. We've got a few questions here in the queue and about 5 minutes left to answer them. So let me get to the first one. First is, what have you found to be the key performance metrics you can pull from your tools? And the second part to that is, what has been the most effective when communicating to business and other risk stakeholders?
Sure.
Repeat that if you'd like.
Nope, I think I got it. I'll make a comment first, and then I'll try to answer it. The first comment is, I think anybody that thinks they have their dashboards and metrics right and ready to go and perfect, I've never found a leading risk manager or a CISO or anything like that that's ever really felt confident in that statement. So it's a learning evolution. But certainly right now, some of the things that I have found invaluable is having an SLA and watching to that timeline. And also especially being able to see the progression of the collection. I personally love calling a vendor out that says, yeah, we're almost done with the questionnaire. I said, well, when you only show 20% of the questions you've answered, how can you almost be done? And it hasn't moved in the last week. Being able to really call the bluff when you really need them to step up and make it a priority, that can only be done with proper KPIs and metrics visible to you. And those are some of the things that I'm seeing a lot more benefit from, and I'm focused on doing. Obviously, that banding concept that I shared a little bit earlier, that's the third thing I'll bring highlight to. Being able to really let senior leaders know, we assess so many, this is where they fit in the banding of risk by their risk level and how many issues we found. So they really see where the worst of the worst is, and by bubbling that up and showing them those names and saying, these are the ones I want to go after and I'm going to track the closure, it helps them really understand that we are focused and not being a purist trying to solve world hunger, but really using the data to drive their valuable resources in their own organization as well as mine to make sure that we're getting the best return on that valuable investment as we can to reduce overall risk.
Very good. Thanks, Keith. This looks like a couple more questions, and we'll get to those. But I think our polling's coming along nicely. 56% voted. I understand if you've joined via the web browser, you may not be able to participate in polling. So that may be the reason for our low participation, just as an FYI. So next question. This one looks like it may be more geared towards Brenda. So what is the trend on scoring and risk ranking, and how does Pfizer's approach help to identify risk tolerance posture?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the risk scoring you have to be very particular on when you're looking at engagement by engagement. And in the Prevalent platform, we have the ability to help Pfizer configure what type of engagement requires what type of due diligence, which then maps to their risk tolerance on their key controls that they've selected for those engagements. And then we're able to help them to determine from regulatory requirements and perspectives on how that maps to NIST, or how that maps to ISO, or how that maps to their key controls with a push of a filter button. So it's really exciting to see how they've pre-set and prepared all of their content for the appropriate configuration to look at scoring and ranking, and then continuously evaluate based on the risk scores that they're able to realize within the solution. So that's how the Prevalent solution is helping Pfizer today.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing. It was one of our core requirements to say the scoring model has to have some configurability to it in order for what solution we select. And that was because we see it as critical to be able to make sure we're tuning the system to really benefit our business and our activities. And certainly the platform that Prevalent has allows me to adjust the scoring methodology within reason and really pull my key control indicating questions up as the top scores above everything else. And that's been very valuable to really make the reports coming out of the system focused where I want them to be focused to help my business.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one final question. Now, I've been fielding most of, using my marketing expertise, I've been fielding most of the technical questions for you, Keith, but I've left one. So it says, do you have recommendations on how to handle CUEC as listed in the SOC 2 report? Now, you're welcome to take that offline as well.
Yeah, I mean, the SOC 2 report, that's pretty detailed, but the answer I will say is this, is a SOC 2 report is an alternative assessment method that in some cases can really make it unnecessary to do, depending on risk, a full questionnaire. The gotcha that I would have with any part of the SOC 2 is being very careful you understand again, the metadata up front and prepared to understand the engagement going in, and making sure that the scope of the actual SOC 2 matches what you were planning to do. So keeping that in mind as you make those kind of decisions that's being asked, I think is absolutely critical to success. If you're going to use an alternative method like those specific sections and et cetera, and services of the SOC 2.
Exactly what I was going to say. Thank you, Keith.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Keith, a special thank you to you. Really appreciate you presenting today. And Brenda, hope everyone has a good remainder of their week, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.